Imagine holding in your hands a small clay tablet, roughly the size of your palm. It's covered in strange wedge-shaped marks, pressed into the surface thousands of years ago. You can't read it, but archaeologists can. And when they translate it, it says something like this. Amuratum borrowed 1/6 of a shekel of silver from Ikun P. Istar. Interest, 36 barleycorns per shekel. To be repaid in 3 months. This tablet is 3,800 years old. It's older than the Roman Empire. Older than the pyramids of Giza. Older than written history as most people know it. And it's a loan contract, a record of debt. Because here's the thing that will fundamentally change how you understand money. Debt came first, before coins, before currency, before anything we'd recognize as modern finance. 5,000 years ago, in ancient Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq, humanity invented something that would shape civilization forever. Not money, debt. And the rules they created, the systems they built, the crises they faced, they're all still here, playing out in our world today. Because debt, once invented, never goes away. It just changes form. The dawn of debt. When farming created obligation, to understand why debt came before money, you have to go back to the moment when everything changed for humanity. Around 10,000 BCE, humans stopped hunting and gathering and started farming. And farming created something revolutionary. Surplus. For the first time in human history, you could grow more food than you needed right now. You could store grain for the winter, you could plan for next year, you could accumulate. But surplus created a problem. How do you keep track of who owns what? Who contributed what to the harvest? Who gets what share? Before writing existed, people used small clay tokens, little geometric shapes that represented quantities of grain, sheep, oil. Archaeological evidence from as early as 8000 BCE shows these tokens being used throughout the ancient Near East. One cone-shaped token meant a small measure of grain. A sphere meant a large measure. Simple. Functional. The world's first accounting system. But as societies grew more complex, these tokens weren't enough. By around 3500 BCE in the city of Uruk, something remarkable happened. People started sealing these tokens inside clay envelopes, and then, so they wouldn't have to break the envelope to see what was inside, they began pressing the tokens into the outside of the envelope before sealing it, creating impressions. And then someone realized you didn't need the tokens at all. You could just press marks directly into a clay tablet and let it dry. Writing was born. Not to tell stories or record history or communicate with the gods. Writing was invented to keep track of debt. Think about that. The single most important technology in human civilization, the foundation of everything that came after, literature, law, science, history, was created because people needed to remember who owed what to whom. The oldest written documents we have, dating to around 3200 BCE from Uruk, are accounting records, receipts, ledgers, debt contracts. Human beings learned to write so they could document obligations. By 3000 BCE, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia had developed cuneiform script, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay with reed styluses. And the vast majority of the hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets that have survived, somewhere between 70 and 80%, are economic documents. Records of shipments, sales contracts, rental agreements, and most significantly loans. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, lending was everywhere. The mechanics of ancient lending, here's how it worked. Mesopotamia was an agricultural economy. Most people were farmers, cultivating barley, dates, and other crops, but farming is unpredictable. One year the harvest is abundant. The next year, drought, flood, or locusts devastate the fields, and the agricultural calendar creates natural debt cycles. In the spring, before the harvest, food is scarce and expensive. Farmers need seed grain to plant. They need to feed their families until the crops come in, so they borrow. The loans came in two main forms, barley or silver. Barley loans were grain lent to farmers, to be repaid after the harvest. Silver loans were usually for merchants and others engaged in commercial activities. And both types of loans came with interest. This might surprise you, because we often think of interest-bearing loans as a relatively modern concept, something sophisticated economies developed. But no. The Sumerians were charging interest 5,000 years ago, and the interest rates? They were standardized, completely fixed by law, not determined by market forces or risk assessment or negotiation, just set at specific numbers for ease of calculation. For barley loans, the standard rate was 33 and 1/3% per year. For silver loans, 20% per year. These weren't arbitrary numbers. They were chosen because they fit perfectly into Mesopotamia's sexagesimal counting system, based on the number 60, the same system that gave us 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. For silver, lenders charged 1/60th of the principal per month, 1 shekel per mina. Over 12 months, that's 12 sixtieths, which equals 1/5 or 20% in our decimal system. Simple math. Easy to calculate. Easy to remember. The laws of Ishnona, dating to around 1800 BCE, spell it out clearly. Per 1 shekel of silver, interest accrues at the rate of 36 barley corns, 20%. Per 300 silas of grain, interest accrues at the rate of 100 silas, 33%. These rates appeared again 2 centuries later in the Code of Hammurabi, the famous law collection inscribed on a black stone stele now housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Hammurabi's code specifies, a merchant may collect interest of 33 and 1/3% on a loan of grain, and 20% interest may be charged on a loan of silver. These laws weren't suggestions. They were the standardized rates everyone understood. When you borrowed, you knew exactly what you'd owe. And the tablets that recorded these debts were legal contracts, kept in temple archives, in palace storerooms, in the homes of wealthy families. Some families accumulated thousands of tablets, entire archives documenting generations of economic activity. Who made these loans? Initially, it was the great institutions, temples and palaces. Temples weren't just religious centers. They were economic powerhouses, controlling vast amounts of silver and grain. They employed hundreds or thousands of workers. They owned land. They engaged in trade. And they made loans, often at the standardized interest rates, sometimes interest-free as a form of social support during times of crisis. But increasingly, wealthy private individuals, merchants, and officials also became lenders. These tamkarim, as merchants were called in Akkadian, accumulated capital through trade and began lending to farmers and others who needed credit. And credit was essential. A farmer whose harvest failed needed grain to plant next season. A merchant needed silver to purchase goods for a trading expedition. A family needed barley to survive until the next harvest. Debt was the lubricant that made the economy function. But it was also the mechanism that would create profound social crisis. When debt becomes bondage, because here's what happened to people who couldn't repay. In ancient Mesopotamia, just like today, debt had to be secured with collateral. Something of value that the lender could take if you defaulted. For wealthy borrowers, this might be land or silver objects. But for poor farmers, for ordinary families, the collateral was often much more personal. You pledged yourself. Your family, your children. The Code of Hammurabi, in its 117th law, lays this out with chilling clarity. If an obligation is outstanding against a man and he sells his wife, his son, or his daughter, or gives them into debt service, they shall perform service in the house of their buyer or the one who holds them in debt service for 3 years. Their release shall be secured in the 4th year. Read that again. If you couldn't pay your debt, you could hand over your wife, your son, your daughter. They would work in the creditor's household for 3 years to pay off what you owed. This wasn't metaphorical. This was standard practice. Archaeological records confirm that children were routinely used as collateral for loans. The early Mesopotamian evidence shows children being separated from their families because of parental debt. One ancient ruler, Emetena of Lagash around 2400 BCE, proclaimed debt remission and claimed to have reunited children with their mothers, implying that debt had torn families apart. Cuneiform texts document the mechanics. A typical arrangement might specify that a debtor's son or daughter would work for the creditor until the debt was repaid. Sometimes the person pledged was called menzazenim in Akkadian, a person standing in debt service. They were untechnically slaves in the sense of being owned property that could be bought and sold indefinitely. They were debt servants, bondspeople, their labor pledged to satisfy an obligation. But in practical terms, the distinction barely mattered. You were bound. You couldn't leave. Your time, your body, your labor belonged to someone else until the debt was cleared. And often, the debt was never cleared, because interest kept accumulating. Remember those interest rates, 20% on silver, 33% on barley? If you borrowed at harvest time when grain was cheap and couldn't repay, the debt grew. The next year it was larger. Then larger still. For poor farmers living on the edge, one bad harvest could trigger a death spiral of debt. You borrow to survive, you can't repay, the debt grows. You borrow more, you pledge more collateral. Your children go into debt service, you lose your land. Eventually you lose everything, and this wasn't rare. This was widespread, systematic, because the economy had an inherent imbalance. Wealth concentrated upward. Lenders, the temples, the palace officials, the wealthy merchants accumulated more capital. Borrowers, the farmers, the laborers, the ordinary families fell deeper into debt. It was mathematically inevitable. Debt grows exponentially through compound interest. Agricultural production grows linearly at best. The gap widens until something breaks. But here's what makes ancient Mesopotamia fascinating. The rulers understood this. They saw the crisis building. They recognized that unchecked debt was destabilizing their societies. And they did something about it, something radical. Something that would be repeated for over 1,000 years and would eventually influence religious traditions that still shape our world today. They canceled the debts. The clean slate. When rulers wiped debt away, the Sumerian word was Amargi. It means return to mother. The Akkadian terms were Andararam or Misarum. In Hurrian, Shadutu. Different languages, same concept, debt forgiveness. The cancellation of obligations. The restoration of people to their original condition before debt enslaved them. And it happened regularly. Not sporadically, not in response to revolution or uprising, but as a standard tool of royal policy decreed by rulers throughout Mesopotamia for over a millennium. The earliest recorded debt cancellation comes from Enmetena, ruler of Lagash. Around 2400 BCE, he proclaimed Amargi and claimed to have freed people living in debt bondage. About a century later, another ruler of Lagash, Urukagina, issued a similar decree, releasing people from debt service and even clearing the prisons. The practice continued through the Sumerian period, through the Akkadian Empire, into the Babylonian era. Historians have identified approximately 30 documented debt cancellations between 2400 and 1400 BCE, 30 times that we know of from surviving records. The actual number was probably much higher. Hammurabi himself, the famous lawgiver, proclaimed general debt cancellations at least 4 times during his 42-year reign, in 1792, 1780, 1771, and 1762 BCE, when his son Samshu-Iluna took the throne. One of his first acts as king was to issue a debt remission decree, canceling non-commercial debts, forbidding their collection, and freeing those who had been enslaved. The proclamation declared, "I have established restoration throughout the land." These weren't symbolic gestures. They were comprehensive economic resets. When a debt cancellation was proclaimed, usually at the beginning of a new king's reign or during a major crisis, specific things happened. First, agrarian debts owed by farmers to private creditors were wiped out completely. You borrowed barley from a wealthy landowner? Forgiven. Second, tax arrears owed to the palace were cancelled. Couldn't pay your tribute to the state? Cleared. Third, people who had been sold into debt slavery were freed and returned to their families. Your daughter working in a creditor's house to pay your debt? She comes home. Fourth, land that had been foreclosed and seized by creditors was returned to its original owners. Lost your field? You get it back. It's worth noting what wasn't cancelled. Commercial debts between merchants were usually left intact. These were business transactions between professional traders, and cancelling them would disrupt commerce. The Jubilees targeted subsistence debt, the crushing obligations that enslaved farming families and threatened social stability. And that's the key to understanding why this happened. It wasn't charity. It wasn't some early form of humanitarian compassion. This was pragmatic governance. The rulers of Mesopotamia needed functioning societies. They needed farmers who could work the land and produce food. They needed soldiers who could defend the realm. But if too many farmers were enslaved by debt, if too much land was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy creditors, the whole system destabilized. There wouldn't be enough free farmers to grow food. There wouldn't be enough free men to serve in the army. The palace's own tax base would erode because debt-enslaved people couldn't pay taxes to the state. So the kings reset the system. The debt tablets, those clay records stored in temple archives, were literally destroyed. Festivals accompanied these proclamations. People celebrated. Families reunited. For a brief moment, society returned to equilibrium. And then, of course, lending resumed. People borrowed again. The cycle started over, because the rulers weren't trying to eliminate debt. They were managing its worst consequences. They understood that debt was useful, even necessary, for economic activity. But they also understood that unchecked debt would destroy the social fabric. So they periodically cleared it, wiped the slate clean, and started fresh. This practice was eventually codified into law. The biblical tradition, which emerged later in this same region, incorporated debt remission into religious law. The Book of Deuteronomy, compiled around the 7th century BCE, commands that debts must be forgiven every 7 years. The word used is Shemitah, meaning release. Leviticus adds another layer, requiring a Jubilee year every 50 years. After 7 cycles of 7 years, when all debts are cancelled, all enslaved people freed, all land returned to its ancestral owners. The Hebrew word is direr, cognate with the Akkadian and Araram. The tradition, born in Mesopotamia, lived on through Judaism and into Christianity, where the Lord's Prayer's most famous line, "Forgive us our debts," uses the Greek word apolemata, which means financial obligations. But after 1400 BCE, something changed. Debt cancellations in Mesopotamia stopped. We have no records of them continuing. And what followed were centuries known by historians as the Dark Ages of Mesopotamian history, characterized by sparse written records and evidence of violent social conflict between creditors and debtors. Land became concentrated in the hands of large private landowners. Debt slavery became institutionalized. Inequality grew. The societies that had managed debt through periodic forgiveness collapsed into cycles of exploitation and unrest. The lesson was clear. Debt left unchecked devours societies. Debt slavery never disappeared 5,000 years later. The mechanics have changed, but the fundamentals haven't. Modern economies don't use clay tablets or barley loans. We don't literally hand over our children as collateral. But debt bondage, the condition where you're trapped by obligations you can't escape, never went away. It just evolved into forms we sometimes don't recognize as slavery. Consider payday loans. These short-term, high-interest loans target people who need cash before their next paycheck. The typical payday loan in the United States costs $15 to $30 per $100 borrowed for a 2-week period. That translates to an annual percentage rate of nearly 400%. 400%. Ancient Mesopotamian barley loans charged 33%. Modern payday loans charge 12 times more. And when borrowers can't repay, which happens frequently because the loans are designed to be unaffordable, the debt rolls over. Fees accumulate. The amount owed multiplies. People get trapped in cycles where they're perpetually paying interest but never reducing the principal. And when they default, the lenders pursue collection aggressively. In many states, if a payday lender sues and wins a judgment, which is common because debtors often can't afford lawyers or don't understand the legal system, the court can authorize wage garnishment. This means a portion of the debtor's paycheck, often up to 25% of disposable income, is seized directly by the employer and sent to the creditor before the employee ever sees it. You work, but you don't get your full wages. Your labor is being used to service debt. It's debt bondage in modern dress. Federal law technically requires a court order for wage garnishment from private lenders, but the process is often streamlined, and many borrowers don't even realize they can challenge it. Or consider student loan debt in the United States. Young people take on tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans to pursue education, often while they're still teenagers without fully understanding the long-term implications. These debts, unlike almost any other form of consumer debt, can't be discharged in bankruptcy. They follow you for life. And federal student loans, specifically, can result in wage garnishment without a court order through a process called administrative wage garnishment. The Department of Education can seize up to 15% of your disposable income if you default. No lawsuit required. Since 2006, wage garnishments for federal student loans have increased by 40%. Millions of Americans are living with diminished take-home pay because a portion of every paycheck is automatically diverted to service educational debt incurred years or decades earlier. The structure is eerily similar to ancient Mesopotamia. You incur debt, often out of necessity. The interest and fees accumulate. Your ability to repay is outpaced by the growth of the obligation. And eventually, if you can't pay, your labor itself is claimed. Your wages are garnished. Your earning capacity is pledged to satisfy the debt. You're not locked in a creditor's house like an ancient Sumerian debt servant. But you re-locked into a system where a significant portion of your working life is dedicated to paying off obligations that may never be fully satisfied. And it's not just individuals. Entire nations fall into debt traps. Developing countries borrow from international institutions, often at the urging of those same institutions, to fund development projects or cover fiscal shortfalls. When they can't repay, structural adjustment programs are imposed, requiring cuts to social spending, privatization of public assets, and economic policies dictated by foreign creditors. The nation's economic sovereignty is compromised. Its resources are directed toward debt service rather than the welfare of its citizens. The parallel to ancient Mesopotamia, where farmers lost their land and freedom to creditors, is uncomfortably direct. Why debt jubilees stopped and why they matter, so why did the clean slates stop? Why did ancient Mesopotamia abandon a practice that had maintained social stability for 1,000 years? The answer seems to be that the balance of power shifted. As commercial economies grew more complex and wealth became more concentrated, the creditor class gained enough political power to resist debt forgiveness. Large landowners and wealthy merchants no longer depended on the state's military protection the way earlier societies did. They could hire private forces. They could manipulate the political system. The kings, or those who came after them, either lost the will or the power to impose debt cancellations against the interests of the elite. And without periodic resets, inequality became entrenched. Debt slavery became permanent. The societies fractured. We see the evidence in the archaeological record, the dark ages of sparse documentation, likely because literacy was concentrated among elites, and record-keeping declined, combined with signs of social upheaval and conflict. When debt is allowed to compound indefinitely without relief, the mathematical reality takes over. Wealth concentrates. The majority falls into bondage. The system eats itself. This is why the ancient Mesopotamian example matters. It shows us that debt cancellation isn't some radical, impossible idea. It's not a modern fantasy invented by activists who don't understand economics. It was standard government policy in the world's first complex civilizations, practiced for over a millennium by rulers who understood that unchecked debt destabilizes society. Hammurabi, one of history's most famous lawmakers, canceled debts 4 times. Not once. 4 times. Because he recognized that periodic resets were necessary to maintain a functional society. And the fact that we've lost this understanding that modern economies treat debt as sacred and inviolable, that creditors' claims are protected while debtors are crushed, that might be one of the most profound forgettings in human history. We've inherited a system where debt compounds eternally, where obligations are never forgiven, where bankruptcy is stigmatized and rare, where even death doesn't release you because your debts can be claimed from your estate. We've created a world where debt is permanent. But it doesn't have to be. The cuneiform tablets prove it. For 1,000 years, societies more ancient than anything in our living memory understood something we've forgotten. That debt is a tool, not a sacred bond. That when it becomes destructive, it can be cancelled. That clean slates, jubilees, debt forgiveness, these aren't violations of economic law. They're recognition of a deeper truth. Debt is power. And power, unchecked, becomes tyranny. 5,000 years ago, rulers broke that tyranny every generation. They freed the debt slaves. They returned the land. They restored people to their families. They wiped the clay tablets clean and started over. Because they knew that the alternative was collapse. We face the same choice now. We're living in an era of record debt at every level, individual, corporate, national. Student loans, credit cards, mortgages, payday loans, medical debt. Trillions of dollars in obligations, growing faster than the economy, faster than wages, faster than people's ability to repay. And we're told that all of it must be repaid. That debt forgiveness is irresponsible, that it would destroy the system. But the system is already destroying people. The ancient Mesopotamians understood something we've forgotten. That societies survive not by enforcing every obligation to the last measure, but by recognizing when the debt burden has become unsustainable and having the wisdom to reset it. That's what Amargi meant. Return to mother. Return to the beginning. Return to freedom. Debt came before money, before writing, before history. It's been with us for 5,000 years. And the rules established in ancient Mesopotamia, the cycle of borrowing, Interest, collateral, bondage, and occasional forgiveness, they're still here, still shaping our lives. Still determining who is free and who is bound. The question is whether we'll remember the rest of the lesson. The part about clean slates. The part about jubilees. The part where society decides that some debts should not be paid, that some obligations must be cancelled, that freedom matters more than collection. Because until we do, we're still living under rules written in cuneiform. We're still bound by debts carved in clay. We're still following the first law of ancient Mesopotamia. Debt is forever. Unless we choose to break it. If this changed how you see debt and history, hit that like button and subscribe to Market Memories. Because the past doesn't just inform the present. It reveals what we've forgotten, and what we desperately need to remember.